Somewhere in the frozen northeast of China, buried beneath decades of silence and state secrets, lies one of the darkest chapters in human history. Not a myth, not a horror story invented to frighten children. A real place, a real program, run by real men in white coats, who called what they did science. It was 1936. The world was watching Europe. Nobody was watching Manchuria. The Imperial Japanese Army had quietly established a biological warfare research unit in a remote district outside Harbin, China. They gave it a clean, forgettable name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But the men inside simply called it Unit 731, and what happened inside its walls would not be spoken of publicly for decades. The man behind it all was Shiro Ishii, a surgeon, a military officer, and by every account, a man of extraordinary ambition who believed that the future of warfare was invisible, carried not by bullets, but by bacteria. He convinced the Japanese government that a biological weapons program could give Japan an unstoppable edge. They gave him funding, they gave him land, and most critically, they gave him prisoners. The facility at Pingfang was enormous, over 150 buildings. Its own railway, its own airstrip, housing for thousands of personnel, researchers, technicians, guards. On the surface, it looked almost institutional, almost academic. Inside, it was something else entirely. The prisoners brought here were called maruta by the Japanese staff. The word means logs. They were not seen as human beings. They were raw material, Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents. Some were captured soldiers, some were simply people who were in the wrong place. All of them disappeared into Unit 731, and almost none of them walked out. What Ishii and his researchers did to these prisoners cannot be softened. They infected people with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax, not through accidental exposure, but deliberately, methodically, to watch how the diseases progressed in a living human body. They performed vivisections, surgical operations conducted on fully conscious prisoners because they believed anesthesia would compromise their data. They froze prisoners alive to study frostbite, then attempted to thaw the frozen limbs using different methods. They deprived people of food and water to calculate how long the human body could survive. They placed prisoners in pressure chambers to observe what happened when the human body was subjected to extreme atmospheric conditions. They exposed people to lethal doses of X-rays. They removed organs from living subjects. They conducted experiments in simulated battlefield wounds, shooting prisoners, then studying the injuries. And between experiments, they tested their biological weapons in the field. Bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped over Chinese cities. Wells were contaminated. Food supplies were poisoned. Historians estimate that the biological weapons developed and deployed by Unit 731 killed anywhere between 200,000 and 580,000 people across China. The scale of it is almost impossible to process. This was not the work of one deranged individual operating in secret. This was a structured, government-funded, military-sanctioned research program with a rotating staff of thousands. Doctors, scientists, men who had taken oaths, men who went home after their shifts, men who later returned to civilian life and became respected members of Japanese society. Because that is the part of this story that most people don't know. When the war ended in 1945 and the Allied forces began their reckoning with war crimes, Shiro Ishii cut a deal. The United States government, hungry for the biological weapons data that Ishii's program had gathered, data that could not be obtained ethically, data that no Western program could replicate, offered him and his key researchers full immunity from prosecution. In exchange, they handed over their research, every chart, every result, every conclusion drawn from every human being they had destroyed. No one from Unit 731's leadership was ever tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Ishii lived until 1959. He died of throat cancer, a free man, in his own home. The survivors, the handful of prisoners who were alive when Soviet forces reached the facility, tried for decades to be heard. China raised the issue internationally. Former prisoners gave testimony, journalists investigated, and slowly, piece by piece, the story came out. But it came out late. And for many of the people who deserved justice, it came out too late to matter. Japan's acknowledgement of Unit 731 has been complicated and incomplete. For years, official textbooks barely mentioned it. The site in Harbin now exists as a museum, a place where visitors can walk through the ruins and read the records and look at photographs of what was done there. Shiro Ishii's portrait hangs in a display, not in a place of honor, but as a reminder, as evidence, as proof that this happened, because that is what history demands of us when we look at something like Unit 731, not to look away, not to file it under war as though war excuses everything, but to look directly at it, at the men who designed it, the government that funded it, the country that protected it, and the other country that quietly benefited from it, and to understand what human beings are capable of when they stop seeing other human beings as human. The logs, they called them. Logs don't feel pain. Logs don't have names, but they did have names, and they deserved better than the world gave them.